let me take you back to the night of March 9th, 1945. It was the tail end of World War II. Progress had been made in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. Germany was on the verge of collapse. Japan was relatively close to the end, not at the end. The war would continue in Asia for another 4 or 5 months. On the night of March 9th, 1945, B-29 Superfortress bombers of the U.S. Army Air Force dropped 1,600 tons of incendiary bombs on Japan's capital of Tokyo. The ensuing conflagration from these incendiary bombs in wood and rice paper houses killed around 100,000 people. It made 1 million people homeless. The goal of the U.S. Army Air Force in dropping those bombs was to attack Japanese light industry, because the light industry of Japan was scattered among residential neighborhoods, as opposed to in large factories in one discrete place away from where people lived. So the argument could be made that they were pursuing a legitimate war aim of destroying the industry that was supporting the war. But part of the bombing campaign of civilian territories in all theaters by all parties was the hope that it would undermine their will to fight. It would undermine their resilience. Think of the firebombing of Dresden in Germany around the same time that also killed tens of thousands of people. The fire in Tokyo destroyed 10,000 acres. It killed more people than either atomic bomb on Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And today, we would call that bombing of Tokyo a war crime. But back then, hatred plus technology plus the context of a war simply resulted in tragedy. Or, as the U.S. Army Air Force might have put it in a press release, victory. The idea of having laws of war goes back thousands of years, both in terms of which wars are just causes to fight, but also how to fight a war once one has chosen to engage in it. The first examples of laws of war we find archaeologically were actually in the laws of Hammurabi, the Code of Hammurabi from around 1750 BCE. And we can also find examples of rules of warfare in the Hindu Mahabharata and in the Torah. So I want to share with you a few rules of war, laws of war from Deuteronomy chapter 20. When you approach a town to attack it, this is starting in verse 10, when you approach a town to attack it, you shall offer it terms of peace. If it responds peaceably and lets you in, all the people present shall serve you at forced labor. If it does not surrender to you, but would join battle with you, you will lay siege to it. And when your God Yahweh delivers it into your hand, you will put all of its males to the sword. You may, however, take as your booty the women, the children, the livestock, and everything in the town, all the spoil, and enjoy the use of the spoil of your enemy, which God gives to you. So, again, we notice at the beginning, there is an attempt to avoid war. You offer terms of peace. Of course, it depends on what the terms are. But if they respond peaceably and let you in, then they have to serve you as laborers, but they live. If they fight back and you have to besiege the city, unfortunately, all the men will be killed, and you can take the women, children, and livestock as spoil. Thus you will deal with all the towns that lie very far from you, that do not belong to the nations hereabout. But in the town of the latter peoples, however, which your God gives you as a heritage, you will not let a soul remain alive. When you conquer the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, you must proscribe them is a nice term for wipe them out, lest they lead you into doing all the abhorrent things they've done for their gods. So those people get totally wiped out, all of the living beings. Well, that's a rule of war, but it's been a may not be ethical rule of war as we think of it. And then finally, when in your war against a city, you have to besiege it a long time in order to capture it, you must not destroy its trees, wielding the axe against them. You may eat from them, but you must not cut them down. Are trees of the field human to withdraw before you into the besieged city? Only trees that you know do not yield food may be destroyed. You can cut them down for constructing siege works against a city that is waging war on you until it has been reduced. Again, the euphemism of war. So here you have a few basic rules of offering peace before conquest, saving some of the lives of those who resist you, even if you destroy the men, and wiping out some cities, but saving the fruit trees. Well, you can decide your evaluation of those particular rules. Now, in Jewish culture, by the rabbinic period, we're talking after the first century of the Common Era, the idea of Jewish rules of warfare were largely an abstract question. The last major Jewish army until the 20th century was the Bar Kokhba revolt, which ended around 135 of the Common Era. So we didn't really have any sizable Jewish armies from that point forward. But it didn't stop the rabbis from coming up with rules. After all, they made all kinds of rules about the sacrifices at the Jerusalem temple when the vast majority of the rabbinic period happens when there is no Jerusalem temple, as is the case today too. And they're still debating those laws in some circles. In rabbinic thought, there were three kinds of war. There was an obligated war, what's called a milchemet mitzvah, commanded war. That's the war of the conquest of those Canaanite peoples that we saw to be put to the sword. There were optional wars, milchemet reshut, things you could choose. Think of the wars of King David, maybe. And the third category they discussed was the concept of a preemptive war, where you might have to attack before you yourself are attacked. Now, as just one example of their limitation of war, the Talmud insists, this is a quote from an article by Norman Solomon called Judaism and the Ethics of War. The Talmud insists that the king would need to seek authorization from the great court of 71 justices, as well as divine approval through the oracle of the high priest before engaging in an optional war. And as these institutions have not existed for 2,000 years, the definition of competent authority virtually rules out the possibility of a non-defensive war. So a war of attack, I mean, you could defend yourself, of course, but a war of attack, you needed the court to all agree on moving forward. And not to mention getting an oracle from God authorizing you to do so. Now, there are other details of rabbinic law that could be applied to the war setting. For example, there's a rabbinic duty to defend yourself if someone is attacking you, or to defend someone else who's getting attacked on the point of death. You're allowed to kill the attacker to save the person being attacked. So when you look at the context of rules about murder or violence or manslaughter, accidental killing, you could apply those in a war context and draw some lessons from them. One of the rabbis who did try to encapsulate all of rabbinic law into one set of volumes was the medieval rabbi Maimonides, who describes some laws of war in his volume called the Mishnah Torah, or his repetition and summation of the laws. And so I want to share with you a short passage from there. So here is his summation of the rabbinic interpretation of these laws in chapter 6 by Maimonides. A war, neither a milchemet hareshut, an optional war, or a milchemet mitzvah, a required or obligatory war, should be waged against anyone unless they are offered the opportunity of peace, as we saw. If they accept the offer of peace and commit to fulfill the 7 commandments given to Noah's descendants, these are a set of rules that Maimonides enumerates later, none of them should be killed. They should be subjugated, as it says in the verse. If they agree to tribute but do not accept being servants, or if they accept being servants but don't agree to tribute, you don't listen to them. They have to accept both conditions. And what does subjugation means? Being on a lower level, scorned and humble. They must never raise their heads against Israel, but remain subjugated under their rule. They may never be appointed over a Jew in any manner whatsoever. Well, that's creating a client, subordinate, not quite slave, but certainly can't be uppity kind of population. That's the mercy tribute, I guess, or the mercy subjugation. And then it describes what kind of tribute would be required. And in the settlement he offers, the king may propose that he is entitled to take half of their financial resources or all their landed property and leave them movable property, or vice versa. Maimonides does note it's forbidden to lie when making such a covenant or to be untruthful to them after they've made peace. And if they do not accept a peaceful settlement, or they agree a peaceful settlement but refuse to accept the laws of Noah, war should be waged against them. The males past majority age should be killed. Their money and children taken as spoiled, but not the women and children killed. And he says, if any of the 7 nations that we saw, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and so on, or the nation of Amalek refuse a peaceful settlement, not one of them is left alive. Now notice, he is extending the peaceful settlement offer to any of those 7 nations, which the Torah actually did not. And he points out that they're not around anymore anyways, so we don't have to worry about this issue. He does also say no offer of a peaceful settlement should be made to Ammon and Moab. Do not seek their peace and welfare for all of your days, it says in Deuteronomy 23. So in any case, he says, if you ever find some Ammonites or Moabites, they get destroyed. When a siege is placed around a city to conquer it, it should not be surrounded on all 4 sides, but only on 3. A place should be left for the inhabitants to flee and all those who desire to escape with their lives. This, by the way, also reminds us of Sun Tzu in The Art of War, who says, attack from 3 sides, but leave a retreat. Otherwise, they fight desperately. The description of fruit trees we saw, and the use of non-fruit-bearing trees. Maimonides extends this to breaking tools, tearing clothes, destroying buildings, stopping up a spring, or ruining food with a destructive intent. That's going too far. And some other details about how to set up an army camp. So again, this is all hypothetical. Maimonides is writing around the year 1200 of the Common Era. The Jews have no armies. They don't have a king for that matter either. But he's trying to apply his understanding of laws and commandments and the Torah to the hypothetical context of Jews having an army. So the final example of a Jewish source on how to approach war comes from the modern Israeli Defense Forces. The IDF has a principle that they call Tohar HaNeshek, which means purity of armaments or purity of weaponry. And the idea is that Israel has an army because it needs to. It has to defend itself. Sometimes it has to attack its enemies preemptively. But the goal is, according to this value, to do so only as much as required and to have a pure approach, an ethical approach to the use of weaponry. So here's an example of their doctrine statement. I'm just going to read it to you, describing their Tohar HaNeshek principle. The IDF servicemen and women will use their weapons and force only for the purpose of their mission, only to the necessary extent, and will maintain their humanity even during combat. IDF soldiers will not use their weapons and force to harm human beings who are not combatants or prisoners of war, and will do all in their power to avoid causing harm to their lives, bodies, dignity, and property. Now, the U.S. Army has a code of ethics as well. Most armies have some kind of code of ethics. And in theory, soldiers can be prosecuted for violation of these codes. But we know the ethos of protecting your buddies. We know it from the Chicago Police Department. We know it from the U.S. Army, investigations into the My Lai massacre, Abu Ghraib prison. I mean, we have plenty of examples of soldiers behaving unethically and the cover-up or the reluctance to prosecute because, after all, they're on my team, not the other team. And the people who suffered were on the other team and not my team. So you can have principles, you can have international rules of law, but they're only as good as their enforcement mechanisms. Now, in the broader world, beyond Jewish life, the rules of war have largely been defined by the Geneva Convention, which were a series of international agreements to govern the conduct of war beginning in the 1860s, carrying through the mid-20th century, especially after each World War. There was a major set of Geneva Conventions in the 1920s, and then another set in 1949, probably the largest round. Now, the Geneva Conventions had limited success in keeping things orderly and well-behaved. After all, Japan signed the Geneva Conventions and was absolutely horrible to their prisoners of war. The Holocaust took place, which certainly was a terrible example of ethical behavior of an occupied population. The Red Army reconquering Eastern Europe and certainly Germany on the eastern part went through a rampage of murder and rape that was certainly contrary to any kind of Geneva Convention. Even America got in the act. If you go visit the U-505 submarine exhibit at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, there's an interesting panel there that discusses the question of what needed to happen with the crew of the boat, because the U.S. Army had actually captured the submarine, but they didn't want to let the Germans know that the submarine had been captured. They wanted the Germans to think it had gone down and all the hands had drowned. But the Americans had not only rescued the boat, they'd rescued the code books. I mean, it was a real treasure trove. But if, following the Geneva Convention, they had taken the sailors from this boat and allowed them to write home and say, I'm a prisoner, it would let the Germans know that they had survived and possibly the boat had been taken. And so they kept them incommunicado, not following the Geneva Convention in that respect, such that their families thought that they had died, and it was a year and a half later they were able to return, and all of a sudden they were alive again. So the Geneva Convention was certainly progress. I don't want to naysay it. Putting these statements into effect, having them as general expectations, certainly has improved the situation for prisoners of war and for civilian populations caught up in war. But nothing is perfect. And there are challenges when one side decides not to follow a particular Geneva Convention item. For example, Article 18 of the Fourth Convention, which is focused on civilians, recommends that hospitals be set up far away from military objectives. But what if the military decides to target, the military of one side decides to target the hospital? Or what if one side puts their military units and facilities in or near the hospital, using the sick as a kind of human shield or a hostage? What if one side breaks those conventions to get an advantage? Do you let them do it? Or do you plow ahead and then blame them for putting civilians in harm's way? You know, if there's a Hamas tunnel under a hospital, is Israel authorized to bomb the tunnel no matter what happens to the hospital and then say it's Hamas's fault? Or is it Israel's fault for bombing knowing that it would affect a hospital? I mean, this is the dilemma in a world where not everybody is following every part of the Geneva Conventions. After all, if everyone followed all the Geneva Conventions, war might be civilized. And what would happen then? So I want to share with you a brief summary of the Geneva Convention. This comes from the Red Cross, which has its own issues from some perspectives. But this is the Fourth Geneva Convention, authorized in 1949, called Protection of Civilian Persons in Time of War. Now notice, this goes up to at least Article 132, written in legalese. So this is a summary version. If you want a more detailed version, you can certainly find them online. So it begins with articles about civilians on the left column here. Civilians are to be protected from murder, torture, or brutality, and from discrimination on the basis of race, nationality, religion, or political opinion. Here's the Article 14 about hospital and safety zone for the wounded and sick, and for children, expectant mothers. Civilian hospitals are to be protected. Care for children who are orphaned, respecting safety, honor, family rights, and religious practices of civilians. Pillage, reprisal, and indiscriminate destruction of property and the taking of hostages are prohibited. They are not to be subject to collective punishment or deportation. They can't be forced to do military-related work for an occupying force and to be paid fairly if they are assigned work. Occupying powers have to provide food and medical supplies as necessary to the population, maintain medical and public health facilities. If not possible, they should facilitate relief shipments by impartial humanitarian organizations. Public officials should continue to run their duties. Civilian, if possible, should be allowed to lead normal lives, not be deported or interned, except for imperative reasons of security. And the conditions of internment should be comparable to prisoners of war as set forth elsewhere. Internees should receive adequate food, clothing, medical care. Information about internees should be sent to a central tracing agency so they're known, just like POWs, and they have the right to receive mail and relief shipments. And a certain category should be released if possible. And all four of them have an identical Article 3. In the case of an armed conflict, not of an international character, occurring in the territory of one of the parties, like a civil war or with a non-government agency, persons taking no active part in the hostilities, including members of the armed forces who have laid down their arms and those placed outside of combat by sickness, wound, detention, or otherwise, should be treated humanely, without adverse distinction founded on any race or criteria like that. So now, if we are grappling with the situation in Gaza and what Hamas has been doing, what it did on October 7th, what Israel has been doing, we can certainly find examples that at least come up to the line of what's described here. Murder, torture, and brutality of civilians, that's what describes October 7th and what Hamas did. Hospital and safety zones and protecting them, well, we've seen, unfortunately, what's happened in Gaza. And again, the question becomes, how do you balance the presence of Hamas near those places with presence of the sick and the doctors in those places? The safety, honor, family rights, religious practices of civilians are to be respected. Well, in a context where they're being moved around in the millions, it's hard to do that. Indiscriminate destruction of property and pillage. Well, we certainly saw that from Hamas. We've unfortunately seen that from some units of the Israeli army as well. They are not to be subjected to collective punishment or deportation. Early in the war, Israel said, no food, no fuel will go into Gaza. This is in the first week or two. Some of the leading figures, including the defense secretary, said something along those lines. That sounds like collective punishment, even though Hamas is certainly part of the population, and part of the population supports Hamas. To say no food or no fuel going in for anyone sounds like collective punishment. Occupying powers are to provide food and medical supplies, or to have humanitarian organizations come in and do that. Well, we've been seeing over the last month this issue where Israel has said for a long time, it's not our fault, we're letting as much food in as anybody wants, and then all of a sudden, the World Central Kitchen trucks are bombed, and a lot more aid is going in, from 100 trucks a day to 400 trucks a day have been making their way in. The challenge now seems to be that there aren't enough trucks inside the Gaza Strip or organizations working in there to actually distribute the food. So now the food is beginning to pile up at the collection sites, and it's not getting out to the people. Not to mention the fact that Hamas also doesn't distribute the food. They often confiscate them for their warriors. As one commentator put it, I think I mentioned last week as well, the Israelis have yet to capture a starving Hamas fighter. So Hamas is getting food, even if many of the civilians are not. In terms of the maintenance of regular order, laws of the occupied territory being enforced, again, it's not workable when the governing agency there, Hamas, is also the terrorist agency that you're fighting. So we can see that the Geneva Conventions here are helping to provide some expectations, but are not enforceable and are complicated by the particular circumstances that Hamas has set up by operating within a civilian population. So this is our challenge in evaluating Israel's behavior vis-a-vis the rules of war. This is not Israel fighting Egypt or Syria or Jordan, as they were in the wars in the first half of Israel's life, from the War of Independence in 1948 to the Sinai War, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War in 1973. It's been asymmetrical warfare now, where you have terrorist organizations or national liberation organizations, depending on your perspective, that are fighting often from within a civilian population, that don't wear uniforms, that don't limit their attacks to military targets. This is what makes this war so complicated to evaluate. So since we're in this season of Passover, I thought I'd ask 4 questions, and I'll give you some thoughts on each of those questions, and then we'll open up for general conversation. The first is, who is a combatant? Who is a legitimate personal target? Now, when you evaluate Israelis, Hamas will say that all Israelis are legitimate targets because every Israeli serves in the army, whether active or reserve. So whether or not they're in a uniform, whether or not they're a civilian, they're a legitimate target because they're all in the army somehow. I've heard that argument before. The challenge is that many Israelis don't serve in the army, whether it's the Arab population or the ultra-Orthodox population or people with physical disabilities or whatever the circumstance might be. And certainly children aren't serving in the army. Senior citizens are no longer in the reserves. So even if you tried that argument, it wouldn't apply to all the people that were killed on October 7th. Now, who is a combatant among Hamas? Israel would say all of them because they're part of a terrorist organization. Hamas might argue that they have wings. They have a military wing and they have a social service and educational wing, and they could differentiate between the two. One of the problems in distributing food that we ran into was that Hamas policemen, because Hamas runs governmental affairs and has a monopoly on force in Gaza before the invasion, after their invasion, that is before this conflict. So Hamas police officers were escorting food trucks. And Israel said, oh, look, there's some Hamas. And they could attack them, which of course led to the lack of distribution of food because now Hamas didn't want to escort the trucks anymore. So are Hamas police officers distributing food legitimate targets? Well, again, some would say yes, some might argue. And then the category that's most perplexing are ordinary Gazans, because again, Hamas doesn't always wear uniforms, and they hide among the population on purpose. And ordinary Gazans, certainly children, certainly the elderly, are not potential soldiers, whether or not they're actual soldiers. The other challenge in deciding who's a combatant is how you assess who's dangerous. Those of you who remember the Vietnam War might remember the phrase a free fire zone. A free fire zone meant this is an area where you can shoot on any person that moves. The assumption is they're all militants. The reality is that even a civilian caught up in that setting will be shot because they're assumed to be a militant. If you're operating in Gaza, do you target any male 18 to 45, assuming they're part of the military wing? Do you have a free fire zone that you shoot anybody? You may recall there was a circumstance where a couple of Israelis had escaped from their hostage status. They had managed to escape their captors, but they were shot by the Israeli army in a terrible tragedy. But it may be a tragedy born from a free fire zone mentality, that if anything that moves and looks male could be dangerous, then you get them. There's been almost no public accounting in Israel of how many civilians versus military figures have been killed. Now, in general, the ratio seems to be about 2 to 1. Israel has claimed to kill about 11,000 militants, as they describe it. The total number of casualties there is in the mid-30s. And so that would assume that Israel is admitting that about 2/3 of those that died were non-combatants. Again, women, children, the elderly, and so on. Now, that's a terrible number, and 30,000 is a terrible number. As far as it goes for evaluating urban combat, a 2 to 1 ratio of civilians to soldiers or militants is actually thought to be pretty good. It's often much higher because of that free fire zone mentality that comes about with urban warfare. I've heard people say, who are very right-wing in Israel, there are no innocents in Gaza. They're all either related to Hamas or going to grow up to become Hamas or supportive of Hamas. And so anybody's a fair target. But that's beyond the pale. And that's beyond the laws of war. There's always a distinction between the combatant and the non-combatant in the laws of war as we understand them today. So deciding whether the dead at Shifa Hospital in the most recent operation there by the Israeli Defense Forces, whether those dead were militants or were they assumed to be militants? Well, that's up for debate, whether you believe the Israeli army assessment or not. So that's question one. Who is a combatant? Question two, what is a legitimate target? If you have a tunnel under a hospital, is that legitimate? Now, the first attack site that Hamas attacked on October 7th was an early warning station of the Israeli army. It's hard to argue that's not a legitimate target. That's an Israeli army station. But then they attacked kibbutzim, and then they attacked a rave party, and then they attacked the city. And they were going for civilians in their safe rooms. And in fact, they had detailed maps of many of these settlement developments from people who had volunteered or who had worked there coming from Gaza to work on the kibbutzim. They had made notes of what the setup of these places were. So they were attacking homes. Those were not legitimate targets. As Israel goes through Gaza, the challenge is, what's a legitimate target? Well, if a home has a tunnel under it, does that make the home a target? If the hospital has a base next to it, can you bomb the base at the risk of harming the hospital? What if there are weapons that are being stored in a school? Unfortunately, Hamas has used these UNRWA, these UN Refugee Relief Agency schools to store weaponry in the past, or rocket launchers. They set up right next to them. Are you allowed to target the rocket launcher at the expense of the school? Defining legitimate targets is an ongoing challenge. The third challenge, the third question, what is acceptable collateral damage? You know what collateral damage is? It's civilians who die when you're attacking soldiers, or civilian infrastructure destroyed when attacking a military target. You hear sometimes this word proportionality. Concept is, what is the acceptable amount of civilian loss for a particular military gain? So if I bomb a car that has 3 high-ranking militants and 2 children, is it worth it that I have to kill the 2 children with the benefit of getting the 3 militants? Now, what if the 3 militants are on a school bus filled with 33 children? Well, you might decide that the proportionality of 33 children to 3 militants is too much. Compared to 2 children to 3 militants, I could live with that. People are being held as human shields, right? But the militants sometimes spend the night sleeping with their family. Can you target the whole family to get the 1 militant? This is the intractable dilemma of the hostage. You know, someone is robbing a bank and they grab a child and hold it in front of them with a gun to the head. You can't shoot through the child to kill the terrorist, but that's what they're demanding you do if you want to get them. And so one of the dilemmas in this war has been the decision-making process of what kind of collateral damage is acceptable for what particular goals. Remember, there was an operation in Gaza a few weeks ago where a couple of Israeli hostages were liberated by a special forces incursion. But to get a distraction to enable them to do that, they dropped some weaponry and some bombs on an apartment building nearby. So all the emergency responders went to that to help the people facing the destroyed building and open up space to rescue the hostages. But how many Palestinians have to die or be injured to save Israeli hostages? How do you calculate that balance? If you want to go back to rabbinic law, the phrasing is, whose blood is redder? How can you decide that one life is more valuable than another? And the final question, after you've grappled with who is a combatant and what is a legitimate target and what is acceptable collateral damage or proportionality, Now you have the question of the marching slogan. Can an oppressed people commit war crimes, or is resistance by any means necessary justified? You've seen that, by the way, in some of the protests supporting the Palestinians, supporting Hamas, demanding a ceasefire now, but sometimes justifying what Hamas did. Some of that, by the way, was even brought up in a recent interview with Cornel West and his running mate, where they asked them, would you be willing to condemn what Hamas did? And they said no. In effect, that they were resisting oppression and therefore they can resist oppression. By any means necessary is the slogan. But remember, by any means necessary means by any means. Does that include rape? Does that include attacking civilians? Does that include taking hostages, including senior citizens? Who gets to decide what is necessary? Whether it's the by any means necessary of resistance or the necessary use of force described in the IDF's statement of doctrine, where it said that they are able to use their weapons and force only to the necessary extent. What defines necessary? Or can you define it after the fact? You see, the dilemma is, once you go to war, you have, to use the Shakespearean phrase, I believe, you've loosed the dogs. You've let loose the dogs of war. And when the dogs of war come out, they come back with blood. It's going to be messy. It's going to be tragic. It is already. And the challenge now that Israel faces in Gaza and that the Gazans face for themselves is described in a scene near the end of the Shakespeare play Macbeth, where Macbeth describes where he is after all the killing that has taken place. He says, it's as if I'm in a river of blood up to my waist. And no matter which way I go, there's going to be more blood. And sadly, for whatever attempt the rules of war might make to make war civilized, General Sherman had it correct. War is hell. And hell, maybe the road to hell is paved with good intentions, they say. And so these Geneva Convention, these rules of war are part of that, maybe paving stones, an attempt to do better, and certainly have improved things in many, many circumstances. But they're not an automatic answer when the guns are started and one side is very comfortable breaking those rules and the other side is flexible when push comes to shove, as most armies are. So with that, I'd like to open up for any comments, thoughts, questions that you have.
The IDF could do better, but I do understand, and I guess that they're not. I don't think they are. They're not doing it. I did more surgically. It were up to me, but yeah, you illustrated the difficulty of this whole thing, and yeah, it's war is hell, and
one of the dilemmas is that I read something recently that Israel has tried employing an AI system to decide on targets, but they've also loosened the proportionality rules to enable more strikes. And, that just leads to more civilian casualties or, pushing the boundaries. We were talking before this session formally started about the attack on the embassy in Syria that had a leading figure of what is broadly acknowledged as a terrorist organization sponsored by the Iranian government. And so Israel knew where he was and knew that he was there at that time, and they took their shot and they killed him. So they hit one of their major enemies, but because it was at an embassy, it's ratcheted up everything, and we have yet to see where that's going to land in the long run. Lior, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, but I don't know how to do these stupid things. It reminds me of I can't get rid of that thing. It's you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And once this started, there was no way to get out of it. Even if you had a better leader, even if you have a leader and not Netanyahu and not his right-wing government. I have a cousin whose daughter is at London School of Economics, and she's writing her thesis. She's doing her PhD on ethics, philosophy and ethics. And on October 7th, she said, Dad, Israel needs to do nothing. So what do you mean they need to do nothing? She said, if they do anything, the world will turn against them. And if they do anything, this cannot turn out well at all. This war will kill many innocents. But you're in the Middle East, and when you don't do anything, your opponent takes that as a weakness and takes that as an invitation to do more.
Well, not to mention, you want to talk about a just war, the cause of a just war. You know, a group that invades your territory, kills 1,200 people, rapes more, takes 200 and some people, either prisoners of war or hostage, whatever you want to call it, to do nothing is inconceivable.
Correct. But the world conveniently forgets what happened on October 7th, and conveniently forgets the 250, and conveniently forgets the 1,700, because they see all of these children and women and people being killed. And what's interesting to me is that in talking to my cousin yesterday in Israel, she says, we're not seeing any of this.
Right.
This is not being reported on our TV. The only way I know about it is what my friends from outside the country are telling me. So the Israelis have no clue have minimum clue, okay, of what's happening. I'll take the no out of it.
And some of them are not upset.
And some of them are not upset.
You know, when the reports of the Tokyo firebombing came back to the United States, I can imagine a lot of people were not upset to hear that 100,000 of those Japs, pardon the phrase, had died. And you know, this is the reality of war, that often you demonize the enemy and the other side becomes all the enemy. I would have loved it if the response of Israel had been, there are over 1 million hostages in Gaza. 250 of them are ours. And the rest are the Gazans that Hamas is controlling, in an authoritarian fundamentalist government. And so we want to liberate our people and liberate the people of Gaza from Hamas. If that had been the messaging and that had been the approach, you would have had fewer civilian. Notice the civilian casualty rate went down quite a bit. From the northern part of Gaza to the southern, they got better and were less liberal in bombing civilian areas. Plus, people evacuated and created space. But you know, if the attitude and the messaging had been what was impossible to say on October 8th or 9th, nobody would have said that. But if that had been the approach, that might have kept global support longer, rather than assuming that Israel is malevolent. I mean, this is ultimately the dilemma, as we talked about last week on the question of genocide, is the question of intent. Are you trying to kill civilians, or are you incidentally killing civilians by aiming for military targets? And or are you incidentally causing famine, or are you intentionally causing famine? You know, it's the intent question. And if you're convinced Israel is a force for evil, then you're always going to assume the worst intent. If you're convinced Israel is a shining beacon and the only hope for world Jewry, then you're going to excuse anything and assume nothing was intentional. And even those soldiers that put up signs like Chabad of Gaza, or who are, looting stuff or intentionally destroying things in people's apartments. Oh, that's, they're just blowing off steam. They're our boys, right? you can excuse anything or condemn anything depending on your reading of it. So this is why Israel has recently said, we're flooding Gaza with aid. We're going to send so much food, they're going to plot. That's an attempt to redress the balance a bit, as opposed to leaving the impression that Israel is intentionally causing a famine, because that would be a genocide. That would be trying to kill everybody. But it's hard to make the genocide argument when you're flooding them with food. So that's part of the give and take of the strategy for the war, and for the strategy for PR. So Susie had a hand up.
So what you've pointed out, and I want to emphasize and pick up on, is a lot of the contention is in the world of spin and interpretation. The events are terrible. The dying, the killing, the atrocities are terrible, but they're spun, they're interpreted. So we have Cornel West saying everything's okay for the sake of liberation. And we have elements in Israel saying we can't do nothing, we have to retaliate. And it all becomes caught up in the spin and the interpretation. And basically the atrocities and the horrendous things continue going until people get so tired of them that they will discount the interpretation and the spin, and they will go to diplomacy and interpretation, which does not resolve the conflicts, so they come up again later. We have conflicts. I mean, we've said it in these sessions so many times. Peoples have memories going back 500 years. They're fighting 500-year-old grievances. And we know that our ancestors, whether the Bible is historically accurate or not, our ancestors were dispossessed of an indigenous land inheritance thousands of years ago. And we've been a displaced people ever since. And that has put us politically disadvantaged throughout history. And a lot of Jewish history has been because, what are you going to do with the Jews? They don't belong anywhere. And we've become the universal scapegoats. So the problem goes back to interpretation and spin, which never gets resolved, even when people get tired of bad events and patch together some sort of interim peace and working situation.
Yeah.
And I don't know that this is going to be any different.
On some level, Israel's goal for the war of not allowing Hamas to ever attack them again makes sense, because if Hamas were still there and still a threat to those border communities, nobody would want to live there. Israel would have lost, effectively lost inhabitable territory, and, live in perpetual fear of an invading enemy. The problem is that their solution is to take a mile or maybe a kilometer's worth of territory from around that border fence and make it uninhabitable for Gazans. So they've knocked down all the buildings. They're clearing out space there. They've built this long road across the middle that they may maintain as a kind of security corridor to be able to get access to the center of Gaza at a moment's notice. So that might be a kind of reoccupation in some ways. The price of their goal becomes overwhelming. And the other challenge, and this is where the laws of war really come into play, even if your goal is reasonable, if the only way to get there is not legitimate, is not just, because the only way to root out Hamas is to inspect the soul of every Gazan. And how are you going to inspect the soul of every Gazan to see if they're really Hamas or not? That's the only way to meet that goal of absolute victory with no Hamas anywhere. The former Israeli president, Shimon Peres, Prime Minister Shimon Peres, once said, you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. That's what makes it hard. And so in the end, there may have to be some kind of deal cut with some kind of rump, what's left of Hamas, whether it's to get the hostages out or to find some kind of ceasefire. But Israel might have to accept the fact that there may be some kind of Hamas left afterwards, because the only way to get rid of it would require not only going into Rafah, which itself would be such a disaster for the civilians that are there and for what remains of the infrastructure that's there, but also the process of weeding out Hamas from everybody is an impossible goal. And I think that's a sad truth that Israel is going to have to grapple with, that they won't get to do everything they want to do because of the realities of what it would take to get there. Now, we've also changed as a society. We didn't mind Dresden and Tokyo back then. There may have been a few people complaining, but they were very, very few. Our tolerance for mass death has gone down, and that's a good thing. But that also means that Israel leaving Gaza, like Berlin 1945, we've seen pictures of Berlin or Tokyo after the war. That's what Gaza looks like now, and the parts that Israel has cleansed. We don't have a tolerance for that anymore, I don't think. Or at least we say we don't. But then it happens. And we have to take the next step after that. Leora.
So looking in your very, very murky crystal ball, how do you think this, what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I heard an analyst just this week who had a very interesting insight. He said it's in the interests of everyone else for Hamas to get out of Gaza also. Because if Hamas stays in Gaza and they spend all this money to rebuild Gaza, Hamas is just going to shoot rockets again. And Israel's going to come back in and destroy the same things they destroyed in 2006 or 2008 and in 2014 and in 2021. I mean, this has happened every several years. And so why would the Qataris pay to build another hospital that's just going to get knocked down again, or another apartment complex, or more housing? Who would waste their money like that? So it's in the rest of the world's interest to get Hamas out too if they want to rebuild. It's in the Palestinians' interest for Hamas to be gone. And what's interesting is it's hard to do opinion surveys in Gaza, right? I mean, imagine, how would you do that? But from people reporting from Gaza, there's more and more willingness to criticize Hamas, to say, yes, these bombs have a Israeli flag on them, but this is Hamas's fault. They did this. They made this happen. They stung the bull. And so there may be more willingness to push back against Hamas, to create some kind of a counterweight governing force for Gaza, which would have to happen anyways for Gaza to be rebuilt. Now, this Iranian attack that had actually produced, ironically, the anti-Iran coalition that they'd been negotiating for anyways, and that Hamas attacked to try to stop, where you have Saudi Arabia and Jordan contributing intelligence to help defend Israel. Who would have thunk? But if you want to have an anti-Iran coalition, that's one step to do it. And so it may be that you get more pushing in this direction against Iran and its influence in Lebanon and its influence in Syria and its influence in through Hamas in Gaza. You get enough of a coalition of the willing or the not so willing, but crossing their fingers and dragging their feet, but moving in the right direction, that you could get a consensus that Gaza should move on. Now, the only thing we have to address at that point are the useful idiots who run groups like Gays for Hamas, who don't know what Hamas is. They need to learn. And so by not making them martyrs, people can learn what they're really about. And again, if there's a consensus to move in that direction, I mean, if you're too extreme for Saudi Arabia, maybe that's a hint.
But I don't think people think about that when they're out marching about from the river to the sea. They're not educated about the complexity of this situation.
Oh, sure. Some of them don't even know which river and which sea.
And in fact, I heard a very interesting thing. Why are the Irish pro-Hamas? Well, it's because Balfour, who wrote the Balfour Declaration declaring Israel should be, or the Jewish people should have a homeland, also was the one who came down with, who sent in all the armies to Ireland.
Well, they also, the Northern Irish in particular, see the Palestinians as an oppressed group just like they are, the Catholics in Northern Ireland. So it's the solidarity of the oppressed move. But that's also why you'll see Palestinian support higher among African-American communities who see Israel as another white occupier, even though the majority of Israelis are technically Mizrahi or Sephardi, not Ashkenazi European. There's the complexities of reality, and then there's our model that just casts our message on there, that it's a black-white racial thing, and therefore that's the truth everywhere, because that's what we experience here in America. Look, education is a long process. It has fits and starts. But if there's going to be positive progress, look, I've signed public letters saying I think there should be a ceasefire. Dayenu, enough. You've done what you could do. You seriously undermined Hamas at the cost of 2/3 of Gaza inhabitation. At the cost of 2/3 of Gaza's housing stock. You've dealt Hamas a serious blow. If Yahya Sinwar comes out of his spider hole and is still there afterwards, I just don't see a way to deal with the people in Rafah to get to him. He just has too many hostages in front of him. He's on a school bus with 1 million people. And you can't blow up the school bus to get to the one guy. So with that as a reality, it's time for some kind of ceasefire, in my opinion. And if we can get as many of the hostages that are still alive out, great. I don't expect very many of those, given the circumstances. And think about what happens after. I've been saying since October and November, what happens next? What happens after? And nobody's wanted to say because, again, political considerations or just not knowing or not wanting to choose. But, it's like that old philosophical dilemma of the runaway trolley car, where you've got 5 people on one side and 5 escaped prisoners on one side of the tracks and 1 innocent baby on the other side of the tracks. And the switch track is coming up and you have to decide, do you go right or do you go left? What do you do? And some people say, I refuse to act. I hold my hands up. What will be, even if it's the train derailing. But refusing to act, not making a choice, is a choice. And you're responsible for not choosing. You have to have the courage to choose, even if there are bad results. And there are going to be bad results no matter what Israel chose to do or what it chooses to do going forward.
And it seems to me that Hamas has achieved its goal.
Well, they've achieved one of their goals. They wanted to, spark a multi-front war. But the West Bank didn't rise up, and Hezbollah, kept it on a low simmer with some rockets, but didn't invade. Like, Hamas wanted a multi-front war. They wanted to conquer. And they ran out there in front, and they looked behind them, and oops. So now they're facing the consequences. And again, if they cause this destruction to Gaza, assuming it would get sympathy for their cause, maybe it did on some level in some places, but not in others. And maybe crucially, we'll see, if they lost the support of if they won the support of the streets of Berkeley and Cambridge, but lost the support of the streets in Gaza City and Rafah, then maybe it wasn't worth it.
Yeah.